Hello everyone, welcome to the complete.NET tutorials. So this is the first tutorial of this entire tutorial series, which I'll be covering. In today's tutorial, what we will be doing is we'll just be creating the basic .NET Web API by default, whichever boilerplate is there, you create it, and I'll also show you how to create basic endpoints uh, following the REST architecture or REST representational state transfer, as it is called. Yeah, so let's begin. So first, what we'll do is we'll create the .NET project in Visual Studio. So let me go create a new project. So the template which needs to be selected is ASP.NET Core Web API. So for this demo, what I'll be doing is I'll be using Visual Studio 2022 because I'll be covering up this entire series using .NET 7. Okay. So I'll name my application as organization.web.api. Okay. And click on next. Yeah. So I'll choose .NET 7 as my framework. And keep this as default. Also, there's since .NET 6, there has been a new feature introduced, which is enabling open API support. That's initially when we used versions 3.1 of .NET Core Web API. We used to do custom configurations for getting the Swagger documentation page, but now it's available by default. So if you see this checkbox, I'll keep it enabled so that we can make use of the Swagger documentation, which comes in .NET 7 by default. Also in .NET 7, they have introduced something called as minimal APIs. But for the purpose of this tutorial series, I'll be sticking to using controllers. So minimal APIs don't use controllers. There's some other way of doing that. So that maybe you can cover up in the next tutorial series. But for the scope of this tutorial series, we'll stick to using controllers. Okay, so let's click on create. So the domain on which I'll be demoing you this entire project is basically an organization domain where organization, it has a company, list of companies, and there are employees which are associated with the companies. Okay, so let's have a look at first. Let's right click, clean the project, and build it just to make sure that there are no build errors with whatever is created by default by .NET for us. So if you just check, if you go to program.cs, so if you compare .NET 7 to .NET 3.1, which was previously available, there are a lot of changes. So you will no longer find the startup.cs file, which you used to otherwise find. They have made it concised, and there's just one program.cs, and everything is just included in that. It looks much cleaner that way. Okay, so let's just try to run this and check what output we get. Yeah, so as you can see, by default, we've not done anything, but by default, the Swagger documentation is available for it for us. Let's run this endpoint. So if you see get weather forecast, this is default boilerplate template of Microsoft. If we execute it, we are getting list of forecasts. Okay, so now let's go ahead. So what I prefer to do whenever I create a web API is always try to clear everything which comes by default. So let's delete this weather forecast controller. Let's also delete the controller and the data which was there. So now we are completely from scratch. There is a program file. So if you see the web application is created using a builder, then controller services are added, then Swagger is configured, then the Swagger UI which we used to see is also available. And there are some other settings like use HTTPS redirection. So this is basically for security using SSL, preferring to use SSL for the API. So in case you try to access the API URL using HTTP, it will by default redirect to HTTPS URL. Okay, then the map controllers maps all the controllers, and finally it's run. So we are good to go. So let me create the first controller. So what I'll do is right click, add controller. I'll say, so what I'll do is I'll right click, add a new item, or I'll just, so the way I like to do this is everything from scratch. So instead of adding the controller directly, what I'll do is I'll add a class. I will call it companies controller. Okay. So now, if you see the class is created, one more feature which you can find in .NET 7 is there's no more the need to have these parentheses for the namespaces. You can just put a semicolon here and do a remove. So you can have a clean structure of the classes. So I have companies controller. Also, another thing I usually like to do is declare the company's controller as sealed so that we know that no, no one can actually create in or inherit from this. Okay, so this is a sealed class. So what you need to do is inherit from controller base, which is present in this namespace. So let's include Microsoft.asp netcore.mbc. So the recipe is gone. So we are using this now. So to make this as a controller, what attribute we need is API controller. So you can put this attribute. Another thing which you need is the route. So you need to provide a route so that we have a clean REST API. So what I usually prefer in the route is an API prefix. So we have API slash followed by the controller name. So for that, you can just mention controller. Okay. So every time you have this endpoints in this controller, it will come up as API slash companies. Okay. Now, the next thing, what I'll go is I'll create endpoints. So since we are dealing with companies, let me go ahead and just create a basic model for a company. And for the purpose of a quick demo of this tutorial, I'll just create the model in this same page. So I'll just call it public class company. Okay, I'll have two properties, one ID. Let's call it a string ID. Okay, and I'll have a name. Let's get rid of these cookies. Yes, empty. Okay, so we have the model ready. So now what we can do is we'll be creating the endpoints which I needed. So since we have companies, we can have endpoints like get the companies. Then we can add a company. We can update a company. We can delete a company. And we can also get a particular company by ID. So let's start creating endpoints for that. So before doing that, let's create a companies list. So in this tutorial, I won't be showing anything related to the database. So let's have a list of companies in the memory. So for that, I'll create private read only list of company, which I have just created here. Let's call it as companies, and let me create a constructor. Here in the constructor, what I'll do is I'll just initiate or initialize it and list of company, and let me create few companies. Call it ID. Yes, ID 123. And let's name the company as company one. Repeat it for different time. Let's have at least 3 companies. Okay, so we have our companies. So now let's start creating the first endpoint. Okay, so that is the get endpoint. For that, we use the attribute HTTP get. Okay, and what I usually like to do is like to have practice of developing with async await. So I'll create all my endpoints asynchronous endpoints. Okay, so for that, public async task. So the return type, the ideal return type you should use for while developing web APIs is HTTP action result. So that you can use the response methods which are available, which will give you specific status like a 200 OK or not found or bad request. Okay, so let me name the section method as get companies. Okay, uh, yeah, and the route. So the route will be API/controllers. So by default, for get, it is understood that API/controllers, when the route is API/controllers or API/companies for that matter, and if the method is get, then it is supposed to get the entities. So we will not specify any route for this specific route for this action method. Okay. Now what I'll do is I'll complete this. I'll just paste in the code here. Okay. So what I'm doing is I'm just returning the companies, and OK will return the status 200. Okay. And since I'm storing the companies in memory and there's no delay, I have just awaited the task and said task complete so that it doesn't throw any errors. So now next, what we'll do is we'll create another endpoint where we can get a particular company by passing the ID. Okay. So again, we do HTTP get. Okay. But this time we can specify a route. So it will be API/companies/company and slash the ID. So that's the standard way with REST. So I will specify company. Since here it will be plural, it will be API/companies. And then if you want a get by ID route, you will have to say /company and then slash whatever is the ID. So in our case, we have ID as the input parameter for this method. And if it was of data type integer, you could specify the data type, but is string. So in that case, I can just specify a particular length, so that in our case, the ID is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So I'll just specify 9, so that we already have inbuilt validation for this. If someone is trying to add an ID which has length either less or more than that. Okay. Now let's complete the method. Let's complete the method here. So yeah, so get company by ID. So the first thing what I'll do is I'll just paste in the code here. Yeah, so first thing what I'll do is I'll find the companies by ID. So I get the required company. I'll just await, let's say task.completed. Then the next thing what you check is if the required company is existing or not in these companies. So if it is null, then what you return is you return not found. Okay, so this is another action method like a response method like okay, which you can return not found, as in it will return HTTP status or not go. And if it is not null, then it will return this. Okay. Now the next one which we can use is add. So I'll just quickly paste in the method for add. If you see, I have created a new endpoint for add now. Now in this case, also I can I've just added company. So whenever you will have an add endpoint, it will be post. So these will get methods. In this case, it will be post. So .NET has its way of recognizing if the method is post and the route is API/companies/company, then it should be the post endpoint. So you expect the entire company object here, which you'll be adding. I just add it to the company and I complete the task. Now the response. So instead of sending OK, a good way for web API post methods is to do created at action or created at route and specify the get by ID route or action, so that whenever the new company which is going to get created, you can just pass the ID, so that in the response, it also gives you the URL of the new resource, that is new company which is created, so that you can run this action method and try to get the details of the company created. Okay. The same way, what we can do is we can create the update method as well. I'll just quickly paste that. Yeah. So same way, I have now created update company endpoint. So in this case, the verb which we will be using is HTTP put. And since we are updating, so we need the ID as well as the actual object which has the new values. So we pass the ID to company/ID. The route again will be company/ID. Same as this one, but if you see, this is HTTP get and this is HTTP put. So that's how you build the API with keeping the REST style of architecture in mind. Okay, so it is expecting a string ID now and the company object. So now, since you are passing two parameters, you need to specify that the second parameter is coming from the body and the first one is actually coming from the URL. Okay, so so now the update method does the similar kind of logic. It tries to find the company, the ID which it passed. So if the passed ID does not match the ID of the object, then it should say bad request. So that's what it is saying, bad request. So it will give you HTTP 400. So if the company is not found for the ID we are passing, it should return not found. And if it gets the data correctly, then what you will do is you just update the company name. And the ideal way to return the response for an update endpoint is to send no content. So it will return you 204 status code. Okay, now the last endpoint which is left is yes, nothing but delete. So let's complete it. And the HTTP verb we'll be using for it is HTTP delete. And again, it is expecting similar route. So this gives you a consistency that the route will be API/companies to get. And in case of posting or updating or deleting, it will be API/companies/company, and then whatever ID you are specifying. Again, it will now take ID as the input. Okay, it will first find the company from the list of companies. If it does not find it, it will say not found. If it finds it, then it will remove it. And then again, in response, the standard way to return the response of delete is no content. That is, it will return 204 status code. But if you want to return ID also, there's no harm. Whatever is deleted, you can return it. But instead, you'll have to use OK and just return the ID in that. But it does not make sense because you actually have the ID which you want to delete. So the standard way is pass no content. Okay, so we have the API set up now. Let's try to run it and check. Okay, so here we go. Yeah, so we have all the endpoints here. So let's try and run this one. What I'll do is I just run it. And if you see, I'm getting all the data back. That is list of JSON. So it is returning all the companies, and this will be your route. So HTTPS. So this is localhost. So it's currently hosted on my local. So it's giving you API/companies. So now if I want a particular company, what I need to do is I specify test ID. Oh, I think we have given the same ID to all the companies. So let's make this change. Go to 2, 3, 4, and 4, 5, 6, so that we have a scenario to test on. Okay, so now if I go to, I'll run this again to get all the content, all the companies on these. So let me try to find this particular company by ID. So I just put in the ID. So since I've given the length here, right? So I'll just show you if somebody puts something less than that length. So you get this default validation of the variable. So if I pass some other 9 characters, so you see, I've passed in the wrong ID. So it is giving me not found, which is 404, which is fair enough. So now let me pass the actual ID, and it should give you the company which is required. So the next thing is adding the items. So for that, we have the post, but the route is the same, API/company/company. So let's add a new company now. So test ID 789, and let me name it as company 4. So for this, I will actually go and debug it. Okay, since we are not using any database, and to actually reflect it, uh, you will not, since we are creating and populating the company list every time in the controller. So every request is a new request for it. since APIs are stateless. So it won't remember the history, even if it has added into the list, because every time we are creating a new list. So for that purpose, let me just debug it and show you how it adds the item. So let's go here and post it. So you see, we've hit the breakpoint, we got the company. So it adds the company. So now if you see, the number of companies are 4, so our company is added. Okay, so our company is added. And if you see the response here, uh, it gives me a 201. So 201 means the response is created successfully. So it's called a created response. So it tells me that the request is successful. And if you, in the location, if you see, it also gives us the endpoint which we can directly fire. So this will be the endpoint where that particular company is created, so that you can directly run this to try to get the details of that. The same thing is with update. So if you want to update something, so let me update company one and change the name of the company to company 11. So I use a put verb with the ID and I change it to company 1 now. Again, to show this, let me just debug it so that you can see what is actually happening. So let's post it here. We have the required company, which is 123. So it's all clear. So now it has now changed the name to company 11. So it was initially company 1. It should change the name to company 11 now. If you see, it's company 11. Okay. Yeah. And the response will be 204, which is no content. So all the 200 series actually means that it's a successful request, and the response has variations of 200. So 200 is HTTPS OK. 201, as we saw in the last, is created. 204 is no content but successful. Okay. Now, last but not the least is delete. Same way, what we do is delete the company test ID 456, and we put a breakpoint so that we see that company 3 is deleted. Okay, and I will just put a breakpoint in the delete endpoint so that you can see what actually it is doing. Okay, so we've got the ID. So it finds the company to be deleted, removes that. So if you see now, the company has 3 items, but when I remove it, so this is how the delete functionality will work. So we'll in the upcoming tutorials, we'll actually build a database model for this and try to store all this data uh, in the SQL database instead of memory. So the item is deleted successfully. Let's click on continue, and again we get the response of 204, which is a success. Yeah, so I think we've covered up almost everything in basic setup of the web API. So that's it from this tutorial. In the next tutorial, we'll be covering up setting up actual structure of the API. So now if you see, we just have one project. So we'll actually structure it. And what we'll be using is an architecture called as which is mostly used nowadays, which is called a clean architecture, or it is also called as onion architecture or hexagonal architecture. So let's cover that up in the next tutorial.